Well, welcome once again to ARTbreak, everyone. We're going to continue with our series where we're featuring artists in the West Michigan area show from this year. And our guests today are Maureen Nollette and Paul May. And we're going to be hearing from Maureen first, and should say that her artistic practice focuses on the significance of work, particularly among individuals who are overlooked or undervalued in our society. And this, in primary case, is women who are involved in caregiving and other domestic functions. She often makes use of ordinary objects associated with these activities: pins, ribbons, thread, cardboard, boxes, and she refers to as frivolous objects, but she uses them in such a way to emphasize their symbolic significance and expressive potential. And what results are works of intimate beauty and an authoritative presence. I should add too that she is a professor in the design department at Grand Valley State University. So please welcome Maureen Nollette.
Hello, welcome. Thanks for being here today. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to begin talking by stepping back in time to make visual links between my past and present work. This will provide some clarity, hopefully. What you're looking at here is Random Acts of Kindness 1. There's a whole series of this work of boxes. There are boxes, just ordinary chipboard boxes, flattened out, gilded with gold leaf, and then meticulously sewn to paper. This series includes, this is one, there's some in the series that have many pushed together to form a puzzle-like pieces. And the reason I'm choosing these boxes, I'm drawn to these boxes. When you flatten out a cardboard box, the score lines, the perpendicular lines, horizontals and verticals, and the score lines they form a grid. I use a grid a lot in my work, and I'll explain that a little bit later. I'm also drawn to the fact that cardboard boxes, they're two-dimensional material, okay? And through a series of cuts, scores, and glue, they become three-dimensional, all right? They're transformed. And I make that link to fabric construction, to garment construction. If you have a piece of fabric through a series of darts, seams, and thread, that fabric becomes a garment, something you wear. So the 2D transforms to 3D again. And I make those connections because I grew up sewing. My mom sewed. She insisted I learn how to sew. So she taught me at a young age. And then I actually studied sewing in high school and was good enough. I got a scholarship to college, believe it or not, back in the home ec days, which no longer exists. But I realized my love of sewing wasn't so much in the end result. It was the process. When you have two pieces of fabric come together, where they meet, that seam, that moment, that action, that binding that held these things together, and how it is unseen when you're wearing your garments. It's on the underside. When you sew from the inside out. You sew in reverse. And so that action, it's I see it as just the passing of time, these small moments, these stitches, these daily activities you could be metaphorical for, and all these things that are kind of overlooked and undervalued is how I see the stitches. And I had a friend, an artist and a writer who wrote about my work, and here's what she wrote. The repetition of women's work so often goes unrecognized. These marks of time and effort, made by the passing of the needle, draw my attention. So here's the full piece here. It's a diptych. And how I made this is I brew a cup of tea, let the tea cool, and then I paint. It's a tea stain on the back of the paper. And then I draw a graphite grid. And on top of the grid, I sew on the grid or in between the grid lines with thread by hand. And I did a lot of stitched work at this time. 2019, we're moving forward in time. This is titled Code Orange. You'll see this is a wood panel. It has some dimension to it. You kind of see the wood grain, and you see my grid again on the back, a graphite grid, very faintly in the background, and I paint in between. And I use the grid a lot in my work. I use it, it's a central theme. I use it to employ textiles, quilting, but also kind of represents societal infrastructure. Here's a close-up of that piece. You see the precision of my grid and then the imprecision of the marks in between. And so my work honors the imperfections. Wabi-sabi is a Japanese term for honoring imperfections. So in a sense, I'm honoring the wabi-sabi of my slow, deliberate process that defies the implied logic of the underlying structure of the grid. Another piece here on a wood panel, smaller piece. You can really see the wood grain here. And this piece, I heated up beeswax and painted it between the rectangles to give that dimension. So a grid in a visual sense tends to flatten out space visually, and it also provides an equal playing field, a field in which a plane in which to build. So at this time, 2019, I'm intentionally placing my work between craft and art, kind of questioning where we place value in society and why. So my work in general is, I would say it's organized in series for the most part. It's usually subtle, sensual, and political in any combination. So now I'm back to my recycled chipboard. I have quite a collection of it. So I teach drawing at GBSU, and I require my students to have a sketchbook and several pads of paper. And so at the end of every semester, they leave their materials behind as if they're never going to draw again. Baffles me a bit. So I have quite a collection. I have these sketchbooks and pads of paper. So I go through them, and then I'm left with the backing, the chipboard, that support system. And I think it's a very beautiful material. It's sturdy, it's rich and earthy in color, and it's very smooth to draw on. And I also like what it represents. So here is this, it's a support system. It's backing to something deemed more valuable. The paper is gone, and you're left with this. But this performs a necessary function. And so I draw the grid on it again with graphite. I have imitation gold leaf, and then that's colored pencil, which just kind of pops on that chipboard color. It's very fun to use for that reason. So now we're jumping ahead, 2020. John Lewis, politician and civil rights activist, died 2020. So I did a series of work kind of based on that, based on something he said. He said it's important to engage in good trouble, necessary trouble, to achieve change. And so the grid is, again, representing kind of societal infrastructure. In the lower right corner, you see the shift in the grid and a shift in color coming and moving across the other grid. And so the shifting grid signifies good trouble, this productive disruption that challenges society's framework or grid. And there's a series of these I did. It's 2021, I just kept going with it. This is a little bit larger. And as I mix the color, the paint, I do in small batches, and so the color shifts ever so slightly. Now we're in 2022. This is June 2022. I was artist in residence at Thread Artist Residency in Senegal, West Africa. And more specifically, I was in a small village called Sincha. That's a village of about 1,000 people that's considered in the bush. It was off the grid. You fly into Dakar, which is the major city in Senegal. You travel by car to Sincha. This is my studio there. It looks nice, right? It was beautiful, the tile floor. I had electricity. I had a door. This was luxury living for the artist in residence. The people in the village had thatched roofs. I actually had a thatched roof too. I kind of like that. But the thatched roofs, I think they had dirt floors. They had no electricity. I was on a solar grid here, and outside of this, no one else had access to that. I had running water. They had well water. And I was artist in residence for a month there. And when I'm describing the village to you because there was no art supply store there, okay? I was told to bring all my art supplies with me. So nothing could be larger than 18 by 24 because that was my luggage size. And so you see my chipboard, my students left behind, traveled with me to Africa. And my plan was to work, I generally work in a rather muted palette, rather quiet, playing with saturation levels, which you see in my beginning drawing there. And then on the right, you notice it's not so, there's more saturation, it's a bit brighter. You see the imperfections of the chipboard, which I love, the graphite line and the color. And the reason I had to kind of change my plan once I got there is because this is Senegal. This is not my image. I was not allowed to photograph the citizens there. This is someone else's image, but this is Senegal. And so you're in a very monochromatic environment, very dusty, dry, hot, especially in June. I didn't realize that was the hot season. And so the women, I was fascinated because you're in this environment. It's like I said, it's dusty, it's dry, it's hot. And the women get up every day, put on jewelry, wear clothing, beautiful clothing, wrap their heads up in matching fabric, and these bright, fully saturated colors. And they go about doing just work. This is what they wear to do their work. And I was just so taken by this thought, this idea, like when I do my housework, I'm not dressed like this, I'm not wearing jewelry. And I was fascinated by that process. And so the work kind of reflected what I was seeing around me and kind of gave up on my plan. And that was part of the residence funded by the Joseph and Annie Alberts Foundation. You may recognize those names. Joseph Alberts, the artist, color theorist. Annie Alberts, the textile artist. And they are a couple, and they have this residency. They have several residencies. But Joseph Alberts' whole idea is eyes wide open. Wherever you go, you just be open to whatever comes for you. They began their work, and the Bauhaus came to America not knowing the language. And so when I sat on this residency, they just don't give you much information. They just kind of throw you into there. It's like, you're an artist, do what you do sort of thing. And so it shifted the way I work completely. This is part of the residency still. These were curtains a previous resident had constructed, strips of fabric sewn together, very quilt-like in my mind, and my love of textiles and fabrics. And so I did some work based on that. Watercolor, again, I had to keep everything small because whatever came in with me had to leave with me. And materials, because of the heat, watercolor, gouache, I worked with materials where I could keep moist for as long as possible so I can accomplish the work. So this is the covered part of where the residency was, the tiled floor. This is how meals were served in these platters. And the reason I'm showing you this image is because, again, Annie Alberts, if you know her work at all, she uses a triangular motif a lot in her textiles and in her paintings. So I picked up on they actually mimic her patterns for the plates. The napkins loosely reference the triangles, and even the serving utensils, you can see, all were Annie Alberts inspired work. And if you're wondering, yes, most of my meals were this color, and it was very spicy. I think it was some sort of root vegetable. And so I did a series of work based on Annie Alberts' influence. They were all around me, these textiles, these patterns. And so the whole residency, unexpected to me, was full of patterns and textures I did not expect to encounter, and bright colors. That's not what I think of when I think of Africa, but that's what the people adorn themselves with, and they surround themselves with that as well. So now I'm back in the States, back to my collection of boxes. They aren't really recycled because I haven't given them up yet, so I can't really say they're recycled. Saved boxes is a better word, maybe. And now I'm playing with the score lines and taking them, playing with the dimensionality by pushing things forward in space instead of flattening them out. I have the grid and the colored pencil again, still sticking with my grid. So this is the beginning of the work that most closely resembles what is seen. Oh, one thing I wanted to point out. I'm going to step back for a second. I did want to mention. Oh, I'll keep going. All right. So this closely resembles what is showing in the museum. It's not the piece that's here today, but this is the series of work I'm working on now. So again, you see my boxes, they're now flattened out. You kind of see the scores, the tabs, and so I'm paying attention to overlapping the forms, tracing them onto the canvas, and some more traditional art making materials as well. This is oil on canvas. So the space in between the boxes is still important, kind of that seam, that moment in between things. And so I'm letting that moment where the two boxes overlap have some importance, the white line you see. That, and I've heard these represented, they kind of look like quilting, which I embrace that reference point, or a topographical landscape of a window. That all makes sense to me. Okay, so now I'm back to my recycled boxes, not really recycled, but anyone recognize this box form?
Looks like a tissue box.
Oh, I do use those a lot. Pasta? It's a pasta box. Okay, the little window, you can see your pasta. So again, let me explain the grid a little bit, since I mentioned the grid a lot, which I use in my work. I went to graduate school at Queens College in New York City, and I went into the MoMA, the Modern Museum of Art, one day. And I did not know of Agnes Martin's work before I was at the MoMA. I just escaped my artistic training up until that point in graduate school. And I see one of her pieces, one of her canvases, a large one. They're 6x6 square. And across it, she draws her graphite grid and then washes the color. And seeing that piece, it was just like, it was calming, it was quiet, and the imperfection of her line, like her wabi-sabi was present. And after seeing that work, I just felt connected to it. I could breathe a little bit more deeply, and it was doing something. And so I just kind of paid attention to what that simple mark making, that simple gesture she did, how that affected me. And ever since then, I've referred to the grid a lot. Not always, but it always seems to make its way back into my work, just kind of a connector, a grounding plane. I remember that moment. I also think these boxes kind of have personalities. This one seems like it has little welcome arms, like for a hug. And so this one's welcome. And the grid is there. I'm playing with saturation levels. Okay, and here we are. Now we're 2023. The last few were as well. So this piece, this is after my residency in Africa. This is after the pandemic. We're all still here, yay. So, and here we are kind of refers to, this is the outcome of where we were, what we experienced. By this point, after the pandemic, I have quite the collection of boxes because I didn't leave the house and everything came to me. And so, and here we are just like, well, okay, I have this material, I'm just gonna keep using it. So that my templates again, I have a better selection of boxes now that have great tabs on them. I'm also at this point teaching GVSU color and design. And so in my work, I'm always thinking about these things, but more so at this moment, because when you teach it daily, you say it daily, it's just in your head. But the elements and principles of art and design, overlap, balance, Gestalt grouping principles, proximity, these are all coming into play as I create these compositions. And then because I'm teaching color, I'm thinking of saturation levels, I'm thinking of value, and that's all coming into the work. And it still has that quilt-like reference, it's still paying attention to the seams. And this is the piece that is hanging in the museum part of this show, Avoir. The title is French to have. When I went the residency, the Senegalese national language is French. The Senegalese speak French. That village I was in, every village has their own language to complicate matters. Where I was at was Pulaar. And so during my residency, I spoke neither well. And so I just took Avoir to have because I'm trying to learn my French again and still coming off of the pandemic. It's just like, wow, our infrastructure here is just so vastly different than what I experienced in that residency. And what we have, our abundance, is just kind of overwhelming and startling. And so just to have kind of made sense. I'm still coming off of that experience to understanding how people on the same planet at the same time I'm alive have such a different life. And so this is oil on canvas. Again, returning to more traditional art making materials. So I'm going to read to you, I wrote a little about the work at one time, not long ago. The trace box forms from flattened cardboard boxes saved after the important contents they housed are gone signify support systems worthy of protection or containment, asking again where society places value, always a reoccurring thing. So this critique, via pattern, shape, color, and scale, rejects the temptation to support our idea of what may be labeled merely ornamentation. Abstract references to typography, tiles, quilts, assume key signifiers underpinning labor, the labor frequently executed by overlooked and undervalued individuals. So I hope to reveal our social bias and permit change through this work. Lastly, altogether, so I'm still using the box forms, tracing them, now introducing watercolor, and then I have my acrylic on top. So the seams you see in between things, those little moments, are now the watercolor coming through. So to wrap things up, if I will, overview. So I'm still honoring the in-between moments, okay, the seams, the moments void of grandeur, right, those quiet little moments that happen necessary, that bind everything together. So I'm going to give you a little homework, a call to action, if you accept it. It's not hard. So look for the themes, the hidden work performed by the overlooked and undervalued individuals, the work that binds society together, this necessary work. Notice them and value them. Thank you. Oh, sorry, question, Jeff. I'm so sorry.
Your work seems very architectural. Did you study a lot of architecture in your graduate school?
The question was, my work seems architectural. Did I study architecture in graduate school? I love that. I wish I would have. No. Building has always been a part. I do work more three-dimensionally at times, and just the design. And women's work actually is sewing is very architectural. It's just, again, overlooked, undervalued because women perform it, but to take these two-dimensional planes and create something three-dimensional, to me, that's not so different than how how architects do work. And so I do link that to sewing, definitely.
Your last piece, I could just see buildings in it.
Okay.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thanks. Any other questions? Quiet group. Okay. I can't figure out how to close this out, or I would. Thank you.
And I should say you can see Maureen's work in the main gallery, and it's on the back of the freestanding wall in the center of the gallery. So, excuse me. Our next guest is Paul May. Paul is a woodworker, and the work in the show is an example of how far he's come with his woodworking abilities and talents. It's a piece of turned wood, which involves turning a piece of wood on a lathe. If you think of something like a baseball bat, only this is much more complicated because he's using layers of different types of wood. And the idea behind this approach is to contrast and have the different woods contrast and complement each other in ways. And then he has also added a very interesting geometric element. I should say that he has really been working with wood all his life. He's largely a self-taught furniture maker. And after getting involved with wood turning, doing relatively simple objects, he became really intrigued with the possibilities that could be done with these segmented pieces of wood. Should say too that he is a retired organic chemist. Spent a long time at, if you remember back in the days of pharmacy in Upjohn, that was where he worked. Was that? Before that, Upjohn. Oh, just, okay, Upjohn, the original. So he has a lengthy experience there, and it's very interesting to see how his interest in wood has developed, and I don't, perhaps there's parallels there too. And I should say that Paul's work is in the second gallery, if you go inside, on the left wall. And if you would take a close look, it's really quite remarkable, the illusion of three-dimensionality he actually creates on this bowl. It's something. Anyway, please welcome Paul May.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate it. I got some visual aids here too. So, Maureen, it was an excellent talk. I would love to incorporate some of your ideas into some of my work, so maybe we'll collaborate a little bit. I really would like to thank you for the kind introduction. I appreciate being part of the 2023 Kalamazoo Area Show and being asked to share some of my work with you here today. But also I'd like to thank my wife, Kathy, for convincing me to enter into the show this year. I'm not the kind of person that would do such a thing. I do appreciate the work that I do, but I tend to keep things to myself. And Kathy encouraged me to get involved. So thank you, Kathy. Love you. As Glenn says, I've worked with wood almost my entire life. Let's get my slideshow up here. Yeah, if you could help me out, I'd appreciate it. So I'll keep talking while they're helping me. I started woodworking on home improvement projects with basic set of tools 30 some odd years ago. Then over the years, quickly expanded my skills to include construction of small cabinets and furniture through a mostly self-study situation and using the internet, which was kind of early in its going when I started. I developed the ability to build fine furniture, including tables, large cabinets, and bedroom suites. When I first became involved with wood turning, it was kind of like, okay, what tool do I not have in my shop? And so I purchased a basic lathe. And I was interested in turning bowls from logs, and I'll go through what that process is in a second. A lot of this is going to be a little bit of background and who influenced me and then how I got to where I am. I learned how to sharpen tools and how to make functional vessels like bowls and cups and things like that. But for some reason, I never took to turning things like that, taking a log and it's usually green, so it's wet, turning things into a utilitarian bowl. I've made a lot of these things, and my kids have a lot of these things still to this day. You walk into a room, you go, oh yeah, I made that a long time ago. So I sold my lathe and I just started building furniture again. So then several years go by, and fast forward to 2020, we all know what happened in 2020. I discovered an article on the internet describing the art of building up segments to construct vessels, bowls, and other things into a crude form, and then you can refine it on the lathe by using sharp woodworking tools. And you can see a few of them up there. I'll describe a little bit what's going on. Turning logs from bowls is essentially, you take a log and you take all the good stuff out of it. The pith is usually no good for turning because it moves a lot. And you can turn, sorry about that. Slideshow from current slide. That should work. Yep. Okay, I'm not going to use this pointer because I know I'm going to screw myself up. But I originally started turning bowls from logs using the methods of Richard Graffin, who was really kind of an expert in his field at the time. And he made some remarkable bowls out of several sections of the log. If you cut the log in different directions, you get different types of bowls, different types of things to look at, medullary rays and quarter sawn stuff, and it's just amazing. So as this evolved, people kind of took hold of this idea, and it turned it into more of an artistic endeavor. You can see the Alan Milland picture at the top. He got his inspiration from sea life, and starts out with a bowl blank and turned it into something then that he could embellish later. Another popular form of woodworking is what's called live edge turning. And you can see the examples down the bottom. And these are actually something that I would do getting back into turning things from logs because I think they're beautiful. David Ellsworth developed a process by which you can take a log, cut it up into a chunk, put it on a lathe, turn it, and then enter a tool through a hole that either you can drill or you can plow through with a woodworking tool and actually hollow this thing out from the inside. And it kind of mimics pottery in that when you're making a bowl or pot on a potter's wheel, you essentially have just one hole that you're working with, albeit a very small one. But he's developed tools and everything to get inside these vessels. It's not cut in half and then glued back together. These things are just hollowed out from the middle in a very tedious process. And I'll get back to David Ellsworth in a minute. There's also bowls from a board, and I think this is kind of an overlooked part of wood turning, which is actually really fascinating, where you can take a board and you can take a piece of plywood if you want, and you cut concentric rings out of it, and you cut those on an angle. And then when you flip them over, then you can actually stack them into a bowl-like shape. And if you vary the angle on those cuts, you can make very interesting shapes. To get the included designs on these, what you do is you laminate a board together to give you a specific outcome at the end. And Michael Mote is really a pioneer in this type of woodworking. And I'm in the midst right now of trying to figure out how to do that. Cindy Drozda also is another one of these people who have taken blocks of wood and turned them into fascinating sculptured boxes with these really elaborate and delicate finials on top. The one on the left there is actually not from a blank, but it's from a material called Banksia wood. And it's illegal to import that into the United States, but there are channels to get that into the US. And from what I understand, it comes in the shape of a cone, and you manipulate it to give you a shape that you want. It's very hard to work with. So anyone that uses Banksia in any of their objects should be applauded. You can come up with some remarkable things, but it's not very easy to work with. Water break. Okay, so let's talk about wood turning in and of itself. We all know what spindle turning is, and Glenn alluded to it before. You can make things. What spindle turning is you get a blank of wood and you put it between two centers on a lathe, and then you turn it, and it's all face grain turning, so you don't get as many catches with your tools. It cleans up very nicely. You can make things like balusters for staircases and table legs and stuff like that. You can make baseball bats. You can see, those are a little bit odd baseball bats, but there's some creativity there. And you can also make off-centered turnings and multi-axis turnings, which is the one on the far right. Of course, people make chess pieces all the time by using the lathe to turn. You can make staved vessels, which is kind of like barrel making, where the bottom section of the vessel is these long pieces of wood that have compound angles on them. And then you have a bottom, and then you have a separator between the bottom and the top, so then you can close it off. And actually, some people also make thicker staves so that they don't have that section from the last fifth to the top, and then you actually curve the stave in and make some very interesting pieces out of that. The one if it doesn't have a name on it, it's one that I made. So that's a vessel that I just recently completed. But we now can talk about segmented woodworking. And segmented woodworking is really fascinating, and I'll talk about a little bit of the things that I have made, but I also want to tell you a little bit about some of my heroes in this field and some of the background, how they got to this point in the development of this process. What you're essentially doing, it's also called polychromatic turning, where you can take woods of different colors and glue them together to either create a picture, create a pattern, create a story with pieces of wood. And they can be very small, they can be larger pieces. What you do is you cut very accurately pieces of wood that can be combined into a circle, a crude circle that then you stack into a form, and I'll show you that in a little bit. And then once this form is created, you turn it with a tool to get it down to the final shape that you want. And so let's talk about that. One of my heroes right now, actually one of two heroes, is a gentleman named Malcolm Tibbetts. He was a ski instructor out in Wyoming for a number of years, and got himself a lathe, and his story was rewritten almost immediately. He discovered that he really enjoyed working with wood, turning things that are just kind of, not what you consider in the mainstream. He's actually had pieces shown at Burning Man out in California, and I don't know how he gets as much work done as he actually does, but some of the stuff that he does is really fascinating. You see the middle piece of the little eyeball sticking out of the windows. I thought that was kind of a cute piece. Again, he's worked with Banksia, and then he's come up with a process where you can make these turned donuts that kind of interweave with each other, which he shows all of his processes. None of this is a secret, and you still look at it and you still don't know how you do that. Jerry Bennett is a guy who was primarily involved in creating jigs and helps in the shop to get to these intricate patterns and how to make accurate cuts in segmented woodworking. And this guy's over the top when it comes to what he can do with wood turning and design. All of what you see there, especially the one on the what do you call that one? I can't remember. On the left, those are all segmented wood turns, and he takes wire, and because it's a donut shape when you make it, he can customize it to make it so that you can slip it over the wire, and then he carves the rest of the project out. But he's musically inclined. He also plays guitar. So the one on the far right, On and On, that's probably one of my favorite pieces from him. Okay, so now we're going to talk about segmented vessel design. And this is where I'm just going to show you some of the things that I have done in the short time that I've been working with this medium. First, you want to get an idea as to what you want to make. Do you want to make a bowl? Do you want to make a vase? Do you want to make one of those crazy things like what Malcolm Tibbetts or Jerry Bennett makes? You want to make a unique box like what Cindy Drossett makes. You want to make something completely different. There's people that have done things based on what they've seen from nature. And you look at it, you go, yeah, that looks real. It looks like something I see every day, but it's made out of wood. You can come up with unique ideas, or you can come up with something that's derivative of something else. We're standing on the shoulders of giants when we do things. Nothing is really an original idea until you put your own little spin on it. Pottery and baskets are always the thing that people use as a basis for what they want to make. And you can also do organic shapes. Again, I've shown that before, and things inspired by nature. So when I was in my earlier discovery phase in this process, I did what is basically called a feature ring bowl. And what feature ring bowl is, you have a bowl that you've contrived some sort of shape, and I'll show you that process in a minute. But the elements are centered around what's called the feature ring, and you want to be able to build that first so everything can emanate from that. Typically, you have an accent ring on top, and that wood up there is snake wood. The feature ring that I'm showing here is walnut, maple, pau ferro, yellow heart, and a walnut accent ring around it. And people make them with and without bases, but there's also a main species that goes along with creating these vessels. So you have to have a plan. You have to have a design, a form. What do you want to make? Because you have to come out with something at the end. Otherwise, it gets thrown in a box and you forget about it because it's crap. So you want to transform flat pieces of wood. You want to transform flat pieces of wood into round pieces of wood. And doing that, how do you maintain the integrity of what you want to make? So I brought in some pieces right here of some of the intermediate chunks of wood that I've put together to give you an understanding as to what they actually look like up close. I'll show you some pictures of them. And I'll put a couple of them over on the table there. But there's two parts of this process that is really fun. One of them is conceptualizing and building something like this, something like what you want to put into a ring. Actually, there's three parts that are fun. One of them is if you can actually do it, because there's a lot of challenges involved. You got something flat, you want to put angles on it to make it turn it into a ring. And when you do that, you change sometimes, unless you're clever, what that is going to look like in the final turn part. Because as you turn towards the center, this shape changes. And so you have to understand the dynamics of putting one of these things together. So I'll put a couple of those out there to look at later. More than welcome to come up, and I've got more things to look at. But so one thing that you need to see is how do you want to make something? Do you want to make it kind of static, which is like the radial orientation of the segments, which is on the right side? Or do you want to give it a little bit of movement and turn something that is kind of revolving around a center, which is called radial orientation? If you have a center that has free movement within an angled piece of wood, you could conceivably put as many or as few, well, more than 6, up to however many you want if you have the skill, and turn those things into a perfectly formed radial arrangement just based upon them radiating from the center. So angles are important, but they're less important. The ideas are more important. So my first vessel here, I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to do some sort of feature ring design that I've seen before in my woodworking, doing decorative edge banding that a lot of people use in furniture building. And so this has always struck me as kind of an interesting pattern, okay? And it's out in the public domain. These sorts of things people make to put in furniture. How do you do that? Make a flat thing like that and turn it into a bowl or into a ring to start with. Well, first you have to do the math. And initially when I started doing this, I figured out what shape I wanted, figured out where I wanted to put this ring. I kind of had up in my head where I wanted to put accent rings and things like that. But you have to do the math to understand where the segments go, what size they're going to be, and putting them together, how big that ring is going to end up at the end. Then you have to calculate the size of the segment, because the size of the segment matters in the diameter of the ring. So you also have to have that in your head as well. I used to do these things on paper, and I still do, because sometimes I'm not around a computer, but sometimes you can use a computer to help you figure this out. And I have a program, it's called Segment Pro. You can put in the profile of what you want, and then I imported one of the pictures that I want to be as a feature ring. It kind of helps you do the math, but then I always go back and check it on my own because I want to be sure. Okay, so how do you begin something like that? Well, you start with pieces of wood, right? You have to take pieces of wood that you're interested in, mill them to specific, precise thicknesses. And I'm blessed with the ability to do that because I have some machinery. And so you mill the lumber and you turn it into something that looks like that. You notice that those are kind of inverse of each other because you want to make a checkerboard. And so once you have that, those two pieces are identical in dimensions except for length. Length does not matter, just as long as you have enough. So then you cut those pieces up into smaller little chunks. And all of those chunks have to be exactly the same, because if they're not the same, you're going to see the mistake in the final vessel. So you take those little chunks, you throw them into squares. All those squares are identical. They have to be exactly perfect. If they're not, you're going to see in the final result, that there's something wrong there. Once you have that all together, then you have to put it into a ring. And there's right and left-handedness in these rings, which is why you draw lines on things, because if you don't, you get confused pretty easily. All of those rings are set up so that when they are turned, the squares do not change in dimension or shape because it's on an angle. The separator pieces, it does not matter, because once it goes down to the center of the ring, when you turn it, it's still going to have the same look to it. It's going to be a little shorter as you keep getting down closer to the middle. So once you do that, then you glue it together. You breathe deeply and glue it together. And hose clamps are usually the preferred method to keep these things tight. If you do the measurements correctly, you can put rubber bands around them and it'll hold it perfectly fine for the next step. Okay, so then after you have your ring, you're like, okay, I know my ring, I know the size of my ring, I know what I'm going to put around it. You have to actually surface both sides of that ring so it's exactly right. If there's any imperfections on either side of that ring, you're going to see it in the final result. So then once you do that, then you're going to need to cut wedges for the main body. And the way to do that quickly is based upon a device that Jerry Bennett actually devised. It's called the wedgie sled, where you can take a table saw fence and set it at the appropriate angle and cut perfect segments every time. So you don't have to think about it too much, which saves a lot of time. Once you have those segments, again, the handedness is important. So you see on the right side, there's a squiggle on top. That means that that's the top face of the board. And then the line on the right-hand side alternates with the left-hand side, because every time that you change from one fence to the other, the line changes from the outside to the inside. So you have to make sure that those things go together, and then the rings are perfect. They're absolutely perfect. There's no gaps in these rings, and you won't see a problem in the final design. And that's where the anal retentiveness comes in this whole process, is that you really want to make sure that this is all perfect. I've taken things and got them all the way down to the end of a project, looked at it, and there's the garbage. Because I'm a perfectionist. I don't want, if I see it, somebody else can see it. I don't want that to happen. So these rings are perfect. And once you have these rings, you have to make sure that each side of it, again, is perfectly flat. So I put a piece of sandpaper on a piece of MDF, sand them down, make sure they're perfect. You can run your hand over it. And after doing it a while, you know what is flat and what is not. Once they're flat, now comes more of the fun part, where you're actually assembling this thing. And so you put it on the lathe, and you continually stack rings on top, gluing one on successfully on the other. And because of the way the lathe is designed, I like gluing it on the lathe to make sure all of these rings are almost perfectly centered. You know, it looks like a hot mess right now, but every one of those rings is precisely cut to be in the shape that it's in right now. And you start turning from the bottom as you're stacking this thing together, because there is some inherent wobble in there, because it's not absolutely perfectly 100% round. It may be 85 or 89% round. And once you start turning it, it gets more easily handled on the lathe because it doesn't wobble as much. So I tend to turn them as I go. And plus you can also turn the inside as well. And this is the result. This hot mess goes into this refined structure. And that was the vision that you originally conceived when you want to put it on paper and you want to understand how you do it. And once you get into that mindset of thinking ahead of the game, okay, if I turn this, what is that shape going to look like? There's another one that I brought with me today. More than welcome to come out. That's one of the thinnest bowl that I've ever turned. I think it's less than 3/16 thick from the bottom to the top. My wife calls it the pith helmet. But something like that, when you get done with it, it gets you more intrigued to do other things. And so instead of doing a radial arrangement, you do a tangential arrangement of these rings by doing compound cutting. You can create something like this, which offers a little bit of movement in the basket or in the bowl. It looks like it's being either warped or it's moving somewhere. And if you look inside, you can see it also has some direction to it, which I thought was kind of neat. And so that was another successful endeavor. And you can take it a step further and go nuts and say, hey, I know how to build checkerboards. Let's build a lot of them. And when I was talking about when you turn things into the middle, how the thing looks different if you don't plan it out. If you look at the inside ring, you see there's one in the middle that's always a little bit hokey, because that was the angled one that allowed me to put it into a ring. And so as you turn it towards the center, that size changes. And so for the outside part of it, you have to compensate for that. So that once you start turning the outside, you have to make that piece a little bit bigger so that by the time you get to where it needs to be, it's perfectly the same size as the other ones. Plus it makes it interesting on the inside too. People are looking at it going, why is that like that? So I got some time. So we're going to go on to another one here that I really like. So chevrons, they've been around for forever. Military uses chevrons, gas stations use chevrons. How do you make one like that? Because I love that. I love the pattern. I love the three-dimensional aspect of that. How do you put one of those together from a flat situation into something round? And it's not really an original idea. I'm not taking credit for this because it's been around for a while. But to put it into something that that is your design, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You have to make it your own. You have to decide how you want to do it. And you can either have an open design, which is like this bowl here, or a closed design, which is the top of the bowl comes closer to the inside. I wanted to make a closed design bowl based upon using a chevron of some sort. And of course, you can go to the Wood Turning Pro program and look at it. And this is what the crude blank is going to look like before you turn it. And after a while, I got to the point where I was just doing this. I was saying, okay, I know I want a chevron in there. I know I want this shape. Those are the numbers that I need to calculate for the rings. If I can build the chevron, I can make this bowl. So it's almost doing it in your head, but it's not really, because I can't do numbers like that in my head. Okay, so you got the basic idea. How do you make that? Well, you start out with strips of wood, and I don't know why they show these as little parts in each of the lines, but those are all solid one-piece strips. You can put them into an array like that, and then if you cut them on some angle, you cut those like on a table saw using a fence, and every one of those pieces on an angle are going to be perfect. What do you do with those? You flip them over, and you get a pattern like this. And you're like, oh, well, that's cool. Well, what do you do with that? What you do is you take those things and you devise a method by which you can keep them in the same orientation and cut the triangular parts off the top. So you do that on a table saw. You put two-sided tape on a table saw sled, and you run it through. And these are the guys you get. You get these guys with no angles on, right? Okay, once you do that, then you got a lot of these pieces that you need to keep track of. And when you're doing more than one project, it gets fun. So you need to put a specific number of degrees of an angle on that in order to form a ring. Well, if you're doing 12 of them, you need 15 degrees on each side, because you want 360 total when you put them all together. So it's 30 per times 12, that's 360. So you can do that, and you put them together in a ring. And if you get the thing set up correctly, it's a perfect ring. And then you can make sure that the top is perfect, because it has to be absolutely flat for the next rings to come on. Put it on the lathe. Again, turning it as I go. This is getting close to the end of this one. And this was one that I really enjoyed turning. This is the one that ended up in the show here. And that's the finished product. Again, it's a closed form bowl. And I brought its sister today. So you can look at this one too. What's nice about using woods that have color in them is that you don't have to do anything to it other than sand it, polish it, and that's the finish. The cherry wood will turn dark. All woods will turn color after a while just based on oxidation. So once you understand that as well, then you can kind of plan out, okay, I've got yellow heart down on the bottom here, and that's cherry above it. After a while, that cherry is going to get dark as the Pau Ferro that's on top. And so it almost gets to the color of like a light walnut. And this one has been just in our kitchen for a while, and you can see what happened to it. It's gotten very dark. Okay, so that's the first variation of that bowl. Oh, here's a second variation. I didn't bring it today, but I do like the way that the dark and brown, the dark and light colors go together. And again, that is marble wood on top of that one. I thought that accented it just nicely. So in closing, I wanted to say this has been a really wonderful endeavor for me to get into doing this type of wood turning. I really think, I want to read a statement here that I didn't read. I had all these notes and I just freestyled this thing. So it's something I got off the Welcome Collection art page. It's a museum in London, actually. And it talks about the combination of science and art and how they're two distinctly related fields, but without them, they would probably be less than what they are. Science and art both rely on observation and synthesis, taking what is seen and creating something new from it. Our society could hardly exist without either, but when they come together, our culture is enriched, sometimes in unexpected ways. You look at what art is, and I was talking to Maureen a little bit about this before, about when you look at something, you just go, wow, I really like that. It's because your brain is thinking of things, I think, that are also scientific as well as artistic. You look at like the golden triangle, or not the golden triangle, the golden rectangle in architecture. You look at the rule of thirds in photography. You look at how nature creates things that are asymmetrically symmetrical, if that makes sense. Your brain just likes things that have order. And that's what brings in the artistic aspect of this thing to me. I look at some of the more complicated things that are out there, and there is a lot. The American Association of Wood Turning has only been around since 1986, even though in the 1940s, a real movement in artistic wood turning was just starting. So it took them that long to actually formalize it. Segmented wood turning only started in, I think, the 1990s, the early 1990s. So this is a very, very interesting and exciting field for me. And I could work on this every day and not even touch what I want to do. So I appreciate your time for being here, and I was excited to come. And again, thank you, Kathy, for getting me involved. I'll take any questions if you have them. Yes. Where do I get my logs and wood? Well, logs are easy. You can get those off wood piles. You can go down the street and see people cutting logs. You can ask them if you could have one, if you see it's a good log. The domestic hardwoods I get from a man that I've known locally here for years. I can get walnut, cherry, ash, maple. Exotic woods you can buy online, and there's a place that I use out of Mexico, Maine, called Rare Woods, and you can deal with them directly, and they have a website that shows all the lumber. You can buy individual pieces of exotic wood, so I've been using them for a number of years. Okay, yeah, back there.
What is an exotic wood?
An exotic wood is something that you can't buy from a big box store or from a local lumberyard, not a domestic wood. Some people would say Osage orange is kind of an exotic wood because you can't find it very often because it's hard to mill. Nobody wants to use it. Fruit trees are domestic woods that are also hard to find. Exotic woods come from Africa, South America, Asia, but primarily from Africa and South America. And the place that I use deals with sustainable sources, which I think is very important to me. This clear cutting stuff that they've been doing is just, I can't abide. So these guys are very ecologically aware as to what's going on. It doesn't take much. You don't need much for your vessel. Yes, sir.
Is it hard to maintain the wood? I mean, like, let's say you have the bowl right there. Is it something you have to do constantly to keep it polished, make it last?
No, actually, yeah. The question was, I have to repeat it because the live stream. The question was, do I need to do any maintenance on the bowls after I've made them? No, you do not. Once you've sealed it appropriately with wax and polished it, it maintains its appearance. You may eventually want to clean the dust off of it. It's been on a shelf for a while, but yeah, it'll stay like that for years because all the wood has been dried. It's one problem with turning green lumber is that once you've turned the lumber, the water still wants to evaporate from it, so it will actually dry in a strange way. So some people will actually turn bowls twice. They'll turn one initially and then let it sit for a year or so and then come back to it and turn it again. And they'll find that it's been all warped out of shape until they turn it the second time. So feel free to come up and check some stuff out if you want. You can ask me some questions. And again, I appreciate you coming in today.